All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the first of a series of 5 classes with Professor Emerita Pam Jensen. We are so pleased to have her here this evening. If you have any questions during the program, please feel free to send them to me in the chat, and we will share those with Professor Jensen at the end. And she'll be speaking this evening for about 40 minutes, and then we'll be saving about 20 minutes for question and answer at the end. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And just a special note for those, I know a few folks indicated that they required closed captioning for this evening. If that is the case and you need assistance with that, please just send me a message in the chat and I can also help you. It is an option down at the bottom to show subtitles. But if you need assistance with that, again, please just send me a chat and I'm happy to help. So take it away, Professor Jensen.
Thank you very much, Kim, and thank you so much for organizing this event. I know that not everybody who expressed an interest in this class is able to join in, or maybe doesn't even want to join in, but I just want to say that scanning over the names just made my heart beat for joy. It was wonderful seeing so many familiar names, and I hope not to let you down. One of the great things about Kenyan students, I think, is regardless of major or class, Kenyan students have always had to read and have been eager to read difficult materials, primary materials. And in the whole kind of circle of what a liberal education is, this means that Kenyan students might very easily just pick up a book and start to read, not thinking that you have to be in a certain place at a certain time, reading it for a certain purpose, but you just might pick up a copy of the Republic or Rousseau's Emile and read it. And the thing is, there's not a technical vocabulary in these books. And in Rousseau's case, and Plato's as well, there is a poetic literary character to the books themselves. In fact, Rousseau wrote the best-selling book of the 18th century, the novel Julie, or the New Eloise, a novel in letters. And Emile is something like that as well. So if you're reading along, fine. If you're going on the basis of past experience, also fine. But sometime you might be picking up the book to read, and that's all just great. It's entirely up to you, and it is entirely your prerogative because you know how to read, and you can take from books things that will allow you to claim it as your own, regardless of background. One of the things that Rousseau says in the social contract is that if you could reform people's opinions, their mores, their values, their way of life will reform itself for the better. And I think that has a lot to do with the purpose of his book. He says that he is propounding a model of an education, and that model can have an impact on us because it is a book and because it does affect our opinions. Why should we read Emile? I think that's a good question to ask, an important question. And one of the answers that I would give is that over the years, I have found that for students, this can be a transformative book. In the same way that Plato's Republic can be, although Rousseau seems to draw us in more readily because he has a better disposition toward what we might call the passions. And yet, I mean, there are going to be lots of things about which we're going to be raising questions in Rousseau as well. But one in addition to the fact that this is a book that can really change how you think about things, the things that it encourages us to think about together is, are among them are democracy, what might be an education for the good life, or for human flourishing. What is a liberal education supposed to be, and how can you carry it forward in your own life when you are away from school? The way in which we are going to proceed is just, there are 5 chapters in the Emile, or books as they are called, and we're going to take up 1 chapter each week. In our last chapter, I hope we have more opportunity for wider discussion. Rousseau published The Social Contract and the Emile in 1762. And the consequences of that publishing were immediate and rather bad for him. First, the book was banned and burned in Paris, and he was ordered to be arrested. And so he had to leave Paris. And then it was banned and burned in Geneva, Calvinist Geneva versus Catholic France, and he was to be arrested and seized. So he had to go into hiding. He went first to Moutier in Switzerland, and then he even spent 6 months with David Hume in England until they had a falling out. And there's a wonderful book about their argument written by a young scholar. The Emile echoes Plato's Republic. Plato presents the education of guardians of a model city, and Rousseau presents what he calls a model man, a generic man, man in general. And we should probably keep in mind that just as in the Republic, there is an education of the imaginary guardians, and there is an education of Socrates' interlocutors, Glaucon and Adimantus, but there is also Plato's education of us. And this is true of the Emile as well. Rousseau takes on the persona of a tutor, or governor, as he calls him. The governor's education of Emile must also be compared to Rousseau's education of the reader, of us. I just want to quickly read a quotation. I'm using Alan Bloom's, I don't know if you can see this, Alan Bloom's translation of the Emile. There are others that you can get, but I think that one is the best. Rousseau says that the only education that is possible today, since there are no more ancient cities or fatherlands, is a private education, a domestic education. But if you want to get an idea of what a public education would be like, you should read Plato's Republic, or you could read Aristotle's Politics as well, because Aristotle and Plato both agree that the highest function of a legislator is to educate the members of the city. So he says, if you read Plato's Republic, it's not at all a political work, as think those who judge books only by their titles. It is, in fact, the most beautiful educational treatise ever written. Now, when keeping that thought in mind, not only does Plato show us what a political education is, keeping in mind how we shouldn't judge books by their titles, if you look at the subtitle of Emile, it is On Education, which would seem to imply that it has no political bearing whatsoever, but we shouldn't judge books by their titles, so we'll just have to keep that in mind. Rousseau insists that he wants to raise a human being to live a full life and not simply to exist. He doesn't want to raise a citizen. A citizen, if you want an example of that and you don't read Plato, you can go to Sparta, where we are told by Plutarch that the lawgiver of Sparta wanted to make the Spartans unable and unwilling and unable to live by themselves. What they wanted for themselves did not matter. And they were so well trained, like Lycurgus says, that if the city did well, they were happy. If the city did poorly, they were unhappy. It was the only thing that made them happy. And so by contrast to today's world, there was a man who ran for office and was not elected, but he was elated because there were so many other men better than he who were elected. And he also tells the story, although this one to me has a double edge, of the Spartan mother who, when the city was at war and she had sent off 5 sons, she wants to know how the battle went. And so she asks a helot, how did we do? And he said, I'm so sorry to inform you, madam, your 5 sons have died. And she says, base slave, did I ask you that? How did we do? Did we win or lose? And so when she finds out that Sparta won, she apparently goes off to the temple to celebrate. Although I think what happens in that temple is not, we don't really know what happens in that temple. But I mean, you might think this person is a monster, but Rousseau is using her as an example and using the man who ran for office as an example to show us the difference between a citizen and a human being. You can't make both, he says, because by nature, man is a complete whole, but a citizen is a fraction. A citizen is a part of a larger whole. We need educational reform, Rousseau insists, and he presents himself as a reformer. We need an educational reform because we have strayed so far from nature. Modern day life is completely artificial. It has alienated us from our true selves. We are not good for ourselves and we are not good for others. And in fact, if you judge by the way that society, high society or le monde wants us to live, we only appear to be good for others when we're actually only thinking of ourselves. So it's going to be necessary to return to nature. And this education could be regarded as an effort to return to nature. In the 18th century, there was a comic play called The Philosophers, in which Rousseau was depicted crawling on all fours and munching on a piece of lettuce. If that's what you mean by return to nature, I don't think that Rousseau is urging us to go back to a root and berry existence. But what he does mean is that somehow we are to try to reinvigorate ourselves, return ourselves, try to become whole again, and to live without the vices of modern human beings. Rousseau insists that man is wicked. Human beings are wicked, but they are born naturally good. And what that means, according to Rousseau, is that originally the natural man, the natural human being, would not harm another human being. There would never have been a scene like the scene in Hamilton between Hamilton and Aaron Burr, because people don't fight for insults. They don't harm. However, this does not mean that there is no violence. It just means that it's not personal. So that Rousseau says, natural man would not harm a weak child or take food from an infirm old man if he could hope to find his dinner elsewhere. But if he couldn't, he would. And again, it's not personal. So Rousseau also insists that even natural men, nature provides for us in the sense that nature allows us to learn all of the things that we need to learn. But when we are born, we are so completely weak and dependent that we know nothing. We have no will of our own. We have no sense of our own existence. We are unconscious of our own life. And so it will be necessary to take the infant, because this is an education that proceeds for 25 years. It's an education that starts even before the birth of the baby and ends at the time when the child has grown up into a mature human being and is in fact ready, according to Rousseau, to be his own guide, even though he may say the opposite, but he's ready to be his own person. So the first chapter of Rousseau's Emile is about the relationships between the parents and the tutor or governor and the nurse. Rousseau starts Emile with a vehement defense of the nuclear family and a complaint that is vicious against contemporary mothers and contemporary fathers, but mothers of all things. That, there is, for example, an attack on the current fashion of repudiating breastfeeding. And Rousseau speaks in glowing terms of the importance of breastfeeding and the importance of mothers being nurses, so that he will say that the true nurse is the mother and the true tutor is the father. But of course, Rousseau's own experiment takes advantage of the fact that there are no mothers and fathers anymore, because it almost makes it plausible to imagine that there would be an aristocratic family, a French family, who would envision sending their child away to be governed by a tutor. Because the French seem to love novelty, sensationalism, travel, the various kinds of comparisons of culture. All of those things are there. Now, with respect to this issue of the nuclear family, we might say, if the true nurse is the mother and the true tutor is the father, what about Rousseau's own children? He mentions in passing that if you ever didn't do this duty, you are probably going to regret it for the rest of your life. But of course, Rousseau doesn't seem to have regretted it, since he had, according to him, 5 children, and he sent them all off to the orphanage to be raised. Didn't care. Indifferent to their well-being. Since the mortality rate of babies in the foundling homes or in the nurseries was higher than 70%, it's hard to know whether or not they survived. But in my life, I have met 3 people who claim to be descended from Rousseau. One of them was a Knox County resident who happened to have Belgian ancestry. And we had this really important Rousseau scholar speaking at Kenyon. And he came to the talk because he wanted to hear about his kin. And I met another person who was of Italian background named Rousseau, and she claimed to be descended from the Italian branch. Since the babies didn't have little tags on their toes saying where they came from, this is amazing. But it also indicates that Rousseau gets to enjoy all the benefits of paternity with none of the problems. So he didn't raise his own children, and he says that he is not suited to be an actual tutor. Someone asked him several people asked him to tutor, at least in a 4 or 5 year period. And he said, no, and please don't ask me, I'm not suited. But he insists that the same man can only give one education. The same person can only be a tutor once because of the extent of the relationship and the fact that the tutor and the child are not supposed to foresee the ending of their relationship. They're just supposed to assume that they will be together forever. So Rousseau says, I have given myself an imaginary pupil, which of course he doesn't have to leave home in order to raise this imaginary pupil. And he says that the pupil is supposed to be, in the end, suited for all human conditions. He should be able to live comfortably in freezing Iceland or on Malta's burning rocks. But then he says, he sort of corrects himself by saying, it's hard to go from one extreme to the other. So let's stay within the temperate zones, because then you don't have so far to travel. And then, almost as if it were an accident, which I don't think it is, he says, for example, among the temperate zones, we could go to France. And if we have to choose a child, let's pick a rich one, because poor children raise themselves quickly. And it wouldn't be a bad thing if Emile were of noble birth. So you could say that Rousseau is a very untimely person here, but also a timely person. There is something about wanting to appeal to and to take into account French sensibilities, and in particular, someone who might be born an aristocrat, but who would reject all of that on the basis of his education. And that, I think, has something to do with Emile perhaps being a model for democratic people. If one person can only give one such education in a lifetime, you could say with an imaginary pupil, you can write a book about that education, which replicates it 1,000,000 times over so that it will last as long as there are books. And it's one of the things that books might be good for. Rousseau tells us that we are influenced by 3 kinds of educations. The one that nature gives, which is to develop our organs and our faculties. The one that human beings give, which is to tell us what to do with our faculties. And the one that things give, things that are around us, our environment, the objects that affect us. And that these 3 educations are in fact in contradiction with one another. And it's part of the problem, part of the reason why we are in contradiction with ourselves and we are not happy. I mean, again, he takes it for granted that human beings in modern times are just not very happy. And so what it might be important to do then is, in returning to nature, to find a way to harmonize these 3 educations. We don't really have much control over what nature does. And the things around us don't necessarily, I mean, it's hard to control all of the objects that affect a child, although in the book, there is not much room for chance. But the one education over which we have control is the one that human beings give us, the education of men. And so Rousseau purports to be offering that to us. I just want to say a couple of things about the background of Emile. I know that you probably know and have read this book. The Second Discourse is in the background of the Emile. It's an essay called The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. And Rousseau says in the Second Discourse, it is necessary to find the true state of nature. All philosophers are looking for the state of nature, but none of them has ever got there. They spoke of savage man, and Rousseau uses terms like savage and primitive. He doesn't mean necessarily to disparage those things. And yet, in his own education, he relies on the latest science, not medicine so much. I mean, Rousseau insists as a tutor, he would never call a doctor unless Emile were dying. And but he himself was quite dependent upon doctors because he had a terrible tendency toward kidney stones and endured a lot of pain. But what he says in the Second Discourse is that he can take us, or he's going to try to take us to the true state of nature. And he also says that, to the true state of nature. Rousseau has an Adam. Without regard to scripture, he has an actual Adam, the first man, which he presents to us fully grown. The Second Discourse doesn't talk about generation at the beginning of it. There's not even any woman in the very beginning. There is just a completely independent human being, sufficient unto himself, who has very, very small needs and very calm passions. Who is this being? Who is this Adam? He doesn't have the characteristics of Adam in scripture. Rousseau calls him nascent man, N-A-S-C-E-N-T, nascent, or hatching man, man in the process of being born. And he tells us, he takes us in the Second Discourse from the embryo of the species, as he calls it, to the whole history of the species up until now. Human beings as a species have deteriorated from what they once were. And part of the reason they have deteriorated is that no one was in charge of the arc of their development. So in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, Rousseau shows us increasing inequality and decreasing freedom. And he shows us there are 3 milestones. For example, nascent man, nascent society, and nascent government. All of those, however, begin to change. And at the end of the Second Discourse, Rousseau says, at the end of the Second Discourse, I think that people, given the rhetoric of that work, that people might walk away from it thinking one of 2 things. First, that Rousseau is truly the author of Romanticism, that he's trying to promote a longing for a past golden age, to give us nostalgia for this age, and that he has something big to do with the Romantic movement. On the other hand, there are those who walk away from the Second Discourse saying that Rousseau really wants to promote political revolution, because he shows us, yes, the state of nature was not solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes said, but it became that. There is a state of war among human beings, and we are living under absolute monarchy. So there are those who think that Rousseau's purpose in the Discourse on Inequality is to push human beings toward political revolution. I think, however, that he does also tell us another reason, or that his true purpose is neither nostalgia nor revolution. But as he says in the discourse itself, we must have precise notions of the nature of man if we are going to judge our situation correctly. So that I think what Rousseau wants us to do, while insisting that nature is the standard by which we should judge our situation, we have to know nature in order to judge our own situation correctly. And it is by means of comparisons. Think about nascent man, think about contemporary French society. These various comparisons think about savage society, think about new governments, and so on. Make all of these comparisons in order to spark critical thinking on our part. And that is his ultimate true purpose, to make us better judges of the world around us. There is, of course, no original sin in natural man. There is no need to speak about babies, or there is no speaking about babies in the Second Discourse. In fact, it takes Rousseau a long time to mention that there are mothers, because he says babies grow up to have the same vigor and strength as their fathers, without mentioning mothers. So Emile is going to start from the actual embryo and move forward from there. What does natural man need? Well, Rousseau says nourishment, a female, and repose. Or for a woman, nourishment, a male, and repose. No particular female, because there's no love in the world of which Rousseau is speaking. Love, well, Rousseau says a lot of what we think of as love is artificial. It's a way women have found to govern men. But on the other hand, but not when we're talking about, you know, the link between Neanderthal man and Homo sapiens, we're talking about something in which there is only instinct. The natural man does not reason about situations different from his own, whereas we do. The natural man is mostly untapped potential. But nature provides for us to learn things that we need to survive. We learn to surmount nature's obstacles to our preservation without being in the business of hurting others. We become robust, we become agile, we become vigorous. We are not those things necessarily. Our greatest faculties, Rousseau says, in the state of nature are attack and defense. We are alone, idle, and always near danger. And so we begin to undergo changes, and those changes do not necessarily affect our freedom or the equality among human beings for a long time. It is only after the discovery of metallurgy and agriculture, the Great Revolution, that the species begins to deteriorate as the individual begins to perfect him or herself. It is very important in the state of, and possible in the state of nature, to rely on your own arms. And Rousseau seems to take that literally. So he says, for example, and I think that this is a reference to David and Goliath, he says, would he throw stones so hard if he had a sling? No, he has his arms completely in himself. Of course, he's going to develop bows and arrows and that sort of thing fairly quickly, but he carries his arms within himself. Literally, he relies on his own arms. Now, Machiavelli also teaches us to rely on our own arms, but as you know, when Machiavelli tells the story of David and Goliath, he not only gives David a sling, he adds a knife, because in military matters, redundancy is always something good. So Rousseau, at the end of the Second Discourse, and please forgive my spotty survey of the Second Discourse, but it's there in the background. It establishes what nature is. He says that natural man lives entirely within himself. He breathes only repose and freedom. Sociable man, the human being of modern society, lives entirely outside himself. He lives in the opinion of others. He is active, he is agitated, he sweats, he's involved in the rat race. He seeks nothing but status, money, power, a trophy wife, or a trophy husband. And he draws the sentiment of his own existence from what others say about him. So his highest happiness is to become an object of envy for other people. That's why we are always running around trying to keep up with the Joneses. And as it said in a few years ago in the old Lincoln or Audi commercial, which has now become quite overused, and as my mom used to say, jejune and tedious to the expression, you see these people with their fancy cars saying, we are the Joneses. That's the highest point of happiness, that everybody wants to be you. So everything is wrong. We're not happy. We are alienated from ourselves. And the purpose of the education, Rousseau asks, if we could raise a person for himself, what would that person be for others? Is it possible to bridge the gap somehow between nature and society? Is it possible to make a human being whole again and at the same time able to live with others? So that Rousseau at one point will call Emile a savage made to inhabit cities. And that, I mean, there's a lot, there certainly is a lot to that. A lot to make that happen. Okay, so Rousseau establishes himself in book 1 as a governor. He's not so much going to teach precepts as he is going to lead. And that's a very different thing, Rousseau says, because in order to lead, you have to let your precepts be discovered. You can't have any authority. There is not supposed to be any obedience or command in this education. It is all somehow supposed to seem to come from the child itself. Yes, from the child itself. And that means that the tutor throughout the Emile is never supposed to be up front. The tutor is virtually, I mean, he's inconspicuous, to say the least. Rousseau seems to say it would be nice if the tutor were invisible altogether. But he also says at another point in the Emile, there is no subjection so perfect as that which maintains the appearance of freedom. So the tutor is actually, if you want to put it this way, the puppet master guiding everything, the governor guiding everything, but it will not look that way. And the point of his guiding at the beginning, at least, is to prevent bad things from seeping in to the person, to the little child. It's a negative education. It's not so much what the child knows or can, it is about what the child can do, but it's mostly about preventing bad things from happening. In order to keep Emile free, and I should also say that Rousseau doesn't even mention Emile right at the beginning. He just speaks about generic man, abstract man, but soon there is an actual being for us to imagine or to visualize. And I think that has a lot to do with Rousseau's ability to affect opinion, to change opinion by giving us poetry, by giving us this imagined, something we can imagine. The Emile himself. I mean, I think it would be bad if new parents picked up the Emile and decided they would like to, enact all of its maxims. John Dewey took a lot from the Emile in order to affect American education, and Immanuel Kant, who was known as a man of very, very regular habits, picked up the Emile, missed his walk, his daily walk, read the whole thing, and said that this was the only book ever that had put him in the right shape. So Emile is going to unfold the the education is going to unfold in the way in which Rousseau says bathing should unfold. There is the illustration, and the frontispiece to the work Emile is a picture of Thetis, the mother of Achilles, dipping him into the sacred river Styx. Rousseau suggests that's a bad idea. You wouldn't want to make someone invulnerable, because then anybody could be Achilles, and it would sap the whole possibility of courage if you did that. On the other hand, Rousseau does take from that illustration one thing. It is important to dip the baby into cold water, like the cold river Styx. But like John Locke, who says the same thing, you'd better make sure that you're not shocking the child. And this is, in a way, how the education unfolds. You start with the established practice using warm water, and little by little, in an imperceptible way, you decrease the temperature of the water until the baby or the toddler can endure actually cold water, chilly water, which, according to Locke and Rousseau, is the best thing for you. But the imperceptible character of the changes, which is in a way another aspect of the book, it's not at its most radical in books 1 and 2. Although there are things that are different than common practices, especially breastfeeding and the elimination of swaddling, although those things exist, they are not so radical as the things that will be suggested later as Rousseau leads us imperceptibly along. Okay, one thing I wanted to say about breastfeeding, after Rousseau's Emile was published, there began in France a kind of breastfeeding craze. And the librettist to Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro, Pierre Beaumarchais, used one of the performances of The Marriage of Figaro as a benefit to give to what was then, an early Leleche League, or a Mother's Welfare Society, to encourage people to do breastfeeding rather than to send their children out to what Rousseau calls mercenaries, to let them take care of the children. And they were in peril. In his wonderful book, Citizens, A Chronicle of the French Revolution, Simon Schama talks about, just as Rousseau does, babies would be hung on nails and they were fed something that, sometimes they were fed not even milk at all. But it was a way of allowing the nurses to do whatever they wanted or had to do without having the children be a bother. Rousseau says that it's terrible to do this, and yet he has to rely upon a nurse because he's a man. So in order to get food for the baby, he has to find a nurse. And finding a nurse turns out to be a rather major undertaking, but most importantly, she is a non-person, because she is a mercenary. Although to make sure that she doesn't hang Emile on a nail, Emile and the governor go to live in her house. And so Emile is removed very early on, not only from his parents, but from the luxury of his aristocratic home to a rustic peasant home where he will spend his time. Once the baby is weaned, you will never see the nurse again. She simply walks out of the picture in the way in which Rousseau says modern nurses do. This issue of nursing is put by Rousseau in the most stark terms. Let mothers deign to nurse their children, and mores will reform themselves. That everything could be changed. There could be a revolution if only mothers nursed their own children. I mean, at the time of this breastfeeding craze, to me, it's a little bit, I think there might be a lot of posing, a lot of posturing, like Marie Antoinette going to the little Trianon and putting on her Bo Peep costume and pretending to be a shepherd. I mean, I think that the same might be true with some of the women who would go for breastfeeding. But in the long run, Rousseau says, make this one change and everything else would follow. But I think as we go through this book and think about things that Rousseau says, for mothers to nurse their children is going to be a very, very complex matter, a huge matter, because it's going to require, first of all, that marriages be different than they are. In France, Protestants are not allowed to marry. Their marriages are considered, they're allowed to marry, I mean, but their marriages are, their children are considered illegitimate. In Geneva, Catholics cannot really live well, but they can't marry either. So I mean, when you're living under an absolute monarch and everything depends upon your standing relative to the court, it's going to be difficult to say to mothers or to fathers, drop all that and stay home and raise your kids. So from the standpoint of what is really going to be involved until mothers begin to nurse their children, or to put it this way, rather than sending children away to boarding schools or to wet nurses, something will be done so that the home, which according to Rousseau has been destroyed, will now somehow revive. Because I think Rousseau maintains the position throughout Emile that the best antidote to bad mores, the best antidote is the attraction of domestic life. And maybe I should stop there. What do you think?
Sure, I think that's perfect. We've had a couple of questions come in. And as a reminder, if anyone else has questions, feel free to send those in the chat. And of course, we'll be meeting in subsequent weeks, so there will be more opportunities as well to ask your questions as we proceed through the text. But one person asked, does Rousseau believe that children are by nature cooperative or competitive?
That's a good question. He interprets competitiveness among children, I think, as I don't think he thinks that they're competitive necessarily, but just to be on the safe side, there are no other children in Emile's life. And at a certain point, he's only allowed to compete with himself. In book 3, we will see that happens. If children seem to be bad and like to destroy things, Rousseau interprets that to be not a sign of wickedness, but just they're feeling their power. And that's why you should baby-proof your home, and you should buy a thermometer. Even if we're in a peasant's house, we have to have a thermometer so that you can make these gradations. Let the child run around. And of course, since the principle of the education is the habit of having no habits, he would like it if every child were ambidextrous. He would like it if the child had no set sleeping hours, if the child had no set meal time, because of course you have to learn to bear the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. You have to learn to be tough. And that's one of the reasons why when Rousseau picks a child, he doesn't pick a sick child. He says that parents who are married and have children, they have no choice. And they have to love the child they have, and they do. But I, who's serving as the governor, I don't have to take this responsibility on. So I want a healthy, vigorous child. And I'm going to do everything I can to keep that child that way, using all of the science, etc. children are, I'm just going to add one thing on that I just wanted to say. I just saw the other day a little video on YouTube. I sometimes look at laughing babies before I go to bed, so I have something nice in my head. And it was a little baby, and there was an Elmo bouncing around. And the little baby went into paroxysms of agony seeing this and was terrified of this Elmo. And so we know that weak little beings can become very afraid of everything that they don't know. And so animals, noises, things that they aren't accustomed to. So the habit of having no habits seems to require the habit of using habit to desensitize them to things that would otherwise frighten them. So in the same way that you have gradations of water, you also have gradations of ugly things and scary things, so that eventually a child could look at a really ugly mask and not be afraid. Or you start out by looking at little animals, if you're taking a walk, and then you begin to allow them to handle them little by little. A little toad can be cute, but a spider, a snake, things to make sure that they won't be afraid, that nothing is going to limit them. Okay, I hope I answers it somewhat.
Someone else asked if you could please repeat the version of the book that you recommended.
Oh, yes, of course. This is available in paperback. I see some people holding it up already. This is by Alan Bloom. It's published by Basic Books, and it's called Emile or On Education. And it has good footnotes, it has a good introduction, and it's very easy to read. So that would be the recommendation. Any other questions?
Yes, we have a few others. So we'll get to as many as we can here tonight. And again, feel free to think about your questions for future weeks as well. Do you think that taking Rousseau at face value or with the intent to apply his lessons as written to life practical, or is there another way you would suggest approaching the material?
I think that's an excellent question. Rousseau says, as Plato does in the Republic, that the things in the model city are good in themselves and they are feasible. Of course, it would have to snow in hell before the feasibility actually ever came if you wanted the model city. It's not designed, I don't think, to be enacted, but in Rousseau's case as well, he says, the model that I have created is good in itself for education, and it is also feasible. It is not designed for any particular nationality or rank. Let other people worry about applications. I am only here to propound the model. And if you know from the social contract, that is what the legislator does, propounds a model. So I think that the best way to approach Rousseau's works is to think of them as wanting to deepen our judgment and with respect to the people of the times, to change opinions. And I mean, you might say Rousseau has been very successful in many respects in changing our opinions. The one thing we don't like about Rousseau these days is his treatment of women, and we will come to that. The reason is we think he's not egalitarian enough. When we think about why Rousseau was, why they sought to arrest Rousseau, I mean, the answer I think there has to do specifically with religion. Yes, so I would say it can change a life to look upon human existence in one way or another, but I don't see that the philosopher Rousseau has in mind a world practicing these maxims in a literal sense. And yet, I do think that he has influenced our world in many, many ways. And so if he wanted a republic comprising the public, he got that, I think. Okay.
Thank you. And I think this will be our final question. Rousseau speaks about children and liberty, but not about freedom. What is the basis for this in his perspective?
Also a good question. And may I just say as well, if you use my Kenyan email, you may also email me and make further comments or ask any questions you have. He speaks of liberty, but not freedom. Are you asking? Is that the question?
Yeah, the question was, Rousseau speaks about children and liberty, but not freedom. What is the basis for this in his perspective?
Okay. No one can be free who is dependent. And since the child is 100% dependence, in that sense, if I'm understanding the question correctly, you cannot be free. And so most of the childhood education is designed to decrease the child's dependence. So for example, you teach the child by walking the child to the thing that the child wants. You teach the child to estimate distances that way as well. Anything you try as much as possible to increase the feeling of competency or agency in the child, and that will perhaps lead to freedom. I'm not entirely sure that Rousseau always distinguishes those two terms. He speaks about the taste for liberty, which he says modern Europe has lost. But one use of the word freedom would be complete independence. And that, I think, is something that he is working toward in the child.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Jensen, and thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. And as a reminder, we will be continuing this program next Tuesday at the same time. And if any of you had to join late or had to step away or would like to share this program with a friend, we will be posting it on the alumni events webpage later this week, and we will also be emailing it to everyone who registered for this class. So if you know of anyone who registered who was unable to attend, that should be in their inbox as well as yours sometime later this week. And again, thank you so much, Professor Jensen, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again. Thank you.